Hey guys, tonight we slip into a world where every step you take echoes with the weight of secrets. And the creak of the floorboards outside your door could mean something as small as spilled milk or something that will change your family's standing forever. You're not some noble or knight tonight, not the kind of hero who'd win medals or get their name carved in a book. Instead, you're just you, a daughter in a small, smoky house, wrapped in your own thoughts and your parents' hopes, which are a lot heavier than the patchwork blanket you pull up at night. The air tastes faintly of boiled cabbage and old dust, and the world outside seems hungry for stories, preferably stories about other people's shame. Now you might think, well, I could handle that, right? But the truth is, in this world, you probably won't survive this particular story unscathed. Shame here is more contagious than the plague, and no mask can keep it out. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're tuning in from a far-off land or just down the street, let me know where you're listening and what time it is. It's a big weird world, and it's always nice to know who's awake with me. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It starts at home, where almost every story does, especially the ones that are never meant to leave the front door. If you're a medieval girl, you're not really yours. You're your family's best hope, their future, their liability. The odd thing is, nobody writes this down as a law, but everyone feels it all the same. Your mother warns you about muddying your skirts, but the real warning is about getting noticed by the wrong eyes. Your father sharpens his sickle at dawn, but his real weapon is his reputation, handed down generation to generation, as fragile as eggshell. Your worth, it isn't how clever you are or how kind, is how tightly you keep secrets, how invisible you can make yourself, how little you give anyone to talk about. The front gate, if you have one, is more than a fence. It's the line between safety and shame, a line you're supposed to keep on the right side of, even if the world outside doesn't play by your family's rules. See, historians still argue whether this obsession with guarding daughters grew out of ancient property rights or just a long, dreary streak of paranoia, but the outcome's the same. You walk home with your head down, and if a man so much as looks at you for too long, your mother's hands tighten on her spindle. Because here's the thing, every daughter is a kind of investment. Not in the modern Wall Street sense. Nobody's buying stock in you, but in the fragile currency of family honor. One mistake, one rumor, and the whole family's credit collapses. You've probably never had your name whispered in the market square, but imagine if a single smirk, a torn hem, or a walk home alone after dusk could mean the difference between a good marriage and a lifetime of she's one of those. The shame isn't even yours to start with. It's handed to you like a heavy old coat with holes from every previous wearer. Let's not sugarcoat this. Even in homes where love is warm and meals are hot, rare enough. Girls learn early that their bodies are both doors and locks. You don't choose what you protect. You're just told in quiet warnings and worried glances that good girls don't let anyone in for any reason. Lock the doors and keep the shutters drawn, someone says, as if shame can't squeeze through keyholes. It gets weirder. The neighbors aren't just watching to borrow sugar or check the weather, they're keeping score. A torn dress, a late return, a laugh that's too loud at a festival, and suddenly you're a story. Remember, this is a time before smartphones. Your reputation travels faster than the Black Death without even needing a pigeon. Here's a quirky tidbit for you. Some villages, particularly in France, would keep shame benches outside the church. If a girl brought dishonor, whatever that meant, she'd be made to sit there while everyone filed past after Sunday service. You'd think this was for the truly notorious, but it could be for something as simple as being found in a field with your cousin. And if you're thinking, well, at least they didn't have social media, don't worry, the medieval grapevine is just as relentless. Now about those families, you might imagine the stern, bearded father at the head of the table, but mothers often bear the brunt of pleasing honor. The pressure lands on them. If you slip, they failed. If something happens to you, it's their shame too. A rotten apple spoiling the whole barrel. And there's always the lurking suspicion that somehow a girl asked for it just by existing at the wrong place, wrong time, or in the wrong dress. Historians still argue whether these attitudes were mostly survival strategies. Keep the family in good standing, avoid feuds, secure a marriage, or just a grand excuse to control women's bodies. Maybe it's both. Either way, you, the daughter, never get to decide. And if you're unlucky enough to live in a town where the priest, the baif, or the local lord takes a special interest, well, good luck, because no one will blame them, not really. The whispers start at your door, and the shame seeps in like rain through a cracked roof. Here's a reality check. Even if nothing ever happens to you, you never get to relax. You rehearse your alibis before you leave the house. You learn to avoid shortcuts to keep to the busiest streets, to always bring a friend. You practice being small, quiet, careful, like a mouse who knows every crack in the wall. Even the animals seem to get it. There's a reason people joke that cats in the village are all female. They're the only ones who know how to keep a secret. And yet, even when you do everything right, shame is always sniffing around your doorstep, eager for a story. The family's honor is a shield that turns out to be made of paper. And you're the one expected to hold it up in a thunderstorm. If this all sounds exhausting, that's because it is. So, when your mother tucks you in at night and whispers, "Be careful, darling. People are always watching," you know she's not talking about ghosts or wolves. She's talking about a world that feeds on stories of shame and a family name that can break with a single rumor. You wake up the next morning to the sound of roosters, feet scuffling, and someone somewhere shouting about spilled milk. But the real noise, the kind that rattles your nerves, comes from a lifetime of whispered rules about what your body means to everyone except you. You rub sleep from your eyes and remember with a little sigh that your virginity is your family's nest egg, your only insurance policy, and the most fragile glass bevel in the house. It's a peculiar feeling to be valued for something so invisible, so endlessly inspected and yet never truly seen. If you're a girl in this world, your virginity isn't just yours. It's a kind of social capital, a stamp of value, the mark that your family can barter with when it comes time to talk a marriage. Think of it as a banknote that only works once. And if it's stolen or lost, the bank forecloses on your whole family. And that sounds bleak, but it's truer than any bedtime story. You start to realize your body is not so much a temple as a savings account that can be emptied without your consent. It's all a bit ridiculous if you stop to think about it. For boys, growing up means racing down muddy lanes, showing off bruises, or maybe comparing who can spit the farthest. For girls, it's about who can keep a straight face while your aunts and older sisters drop warnings disguised as jokes. Don't let a man touch your hair, or you'll be married by spring. They laugh, but there's a hitch in their throats, a shared memory of someone who didn't get the joke. Here's your first mainstream historical fact. In medieval and early modern Europe, the concept of chastity belts wasn't just a myth. Some families really did lock up their daughters, or at least threatened to, with contraptions that were part steel, part psychological warfare. Even if you never saw one, the stories alone kept you walking with your knees together. But most of the control was less about hardware and more about a relentless campaign of inspections and superstitions. Every festival, every holy day, every rite of passage was laced with rituals to prove a girl's purity. On your wedding night, the family would sometimes wait in the next room to see a blood-stained sheet. Proof, supposedly, that all was right and you were spoiled. If the sheet stayed clean, things could get ugly fast. Some mothers, desperate for their daughters to pass the test, would tuck a small animal's bladder under the mattress or stain the sheets themselves, all to keep up appearances. Fringe tidbit for you. In parts of the 16th century Italy, it was common for midwives to offer secret services, let's call them reputation repairs, to girls who needed a little extra evidence. What if you bled for reasons that had nothing to do with sex? Or what if you didn't bleed at all, even though you were innocent? Historians still argue whether these tests were believed in good faith, or if everyone just played along because no one dared question the system. Either way, you, the main character in this little drama, are always on the defensive, always trying to prove something you can't even see. Of course, purity isn't just a physical state. You have to maintain an entire performance. Your walk can't be too confident. Your voice can't be too loud. You don't make eye contact with men because that's flirting. You don't linger in doorways because that's an invitation. And heaven forbid you're caught alone with someone. Guilt is assumed, proof or no proof. One joke passed from girl to girl. The only safe place is under your mother's apron. Sadly, not even that is always true. You'd think this would make women bond in solidarity, but sometimes fear breeds rivalry. There's always the chance that your friend will out you for a favor, or that your own sister will whisper about you to score points with mother. It's not that people are cruel for the sake of it. There's just so much at stake. If your reputation is ruined, so is your family's. And so are your siblings' chances for a good match. The dominoes fall fast and hard, and nobody wants to be the first to topple. Modern readers might laugh at the idea of checking for virginity, but it gets weirder. In some places, local healers claim to be able to read your body like a book, the tilt of your hips, the clearness of your eyes, or the firmness of your handshake. One Italian text insisted a girl who could break an egg in one hand was definitely impure. Eggs, apparently, are the lie detectors of the medieval world. And if you failed the egg test, well, the best you could hope for was a sympathetic aunt and a very quick wedding to anyone who'd have you. There's a dark humor in it all. Every time you trip on your skirts or blush at a stranger's greeting, someone's measuring you up for purity. It's like living in a never-ending audition for a role you never wanted. A girl's slip of the tongue or a single late return from the well can set the whole village abuzz. The baker's wife will lower her voice and say, "She's not like other girls." And you'll know she's not talking about your bread. Remember, though, this isn't just peasant girls in the fields. Noble women, too, were checked, guarded, and sometimes even imprisoned until marriage. In the courts of France, elaborate contracts laid out every detail of a girl's virtue as part of the marriage negotiation. Daughters of kings had their every move watched and their rooms were locked from the outside at night. The stakes were higher, but the game was the same. For a noble woman, the wrong rumour could spark a war, or at least a very expensive annulment. Historians still argue whether any of this really protected women or just made everyone more miserable. Was it all just about controlling women's bodies, or was it a genuine, if misguided, effort to keep families safe and secure? There's no easy answer, and the more you look, the murkier it gets. Some modern scholars say the whole obsession with purity was just another way for men to avoid blame. After all, if the value is in what hasn't happened, then any crime against you becomes your fault. It's a twisted logic, and it leaves no room for accidents, misunderstandings, or actual affection. If you fall in love, you're reckless. If you're attacked, you're careless. If you marry too late, you're suspicious. And if you're too clever or too beautiful, well, that's even worse. You become a magnet for trouble, someone to be envied, whispered about, or watched too closely. Still, even in this world, girls find ways to laugh. You trade stories at the well, invent games where the winner is the one who can walk with a book on her head and not look at a single boy. You roll your eyes at your aunt's warnings and invent secret codes with your friends for which boys are safe and which ones should be avoided at all costs. Some girls even make a joke out of the constant surveillance. At least if they're watching me, they're not watching my brother get into trouble. But beneath the jokes, the tension is always there. One wrong move, one unlucky day, and everything changes. You try not to think about the girls who've disappeared from the village or the ones who suddenly moved away to live with an aunt. The truth is, sometimes the only thing separating you from scandal is luck, and a family willing to lie for you if it comes to that. By the time you reach your teens, you know the rules by heart, even if you pretend not to care. You walk the narrow line between obedience and rebellion, all while carrying the weight of a family's hopes and fears on your narrow shoulders. You start to realize that in this world, your body is both a burden and a bargaining chip, a thing to be kept, watched, and in the end, given away for the right price. So, you make your way through each day with your head down and your eyes open, hoping that nobody notices you and dreading the day they do. You tell yourself as you fall asleep that tomorrow will be the same as today. Careful, careful, careful. You probably won't survive this without a scratch, but who knows? Maybe, if you're lucky, they'll never know your secrets. Or maybe you'll be the next girl they talk about. Another name added to the list of those who failed to keep what was never really theirs. You'd think waking up to a bright day with the sunlight dancing on your wooden floorboards and the smell of bread drifting in from the neighbor's kitchen that you could take a moment to enjoy yourself. Maybe you'd even sneak outside, let the wind tug at your hair, and forget for a second the careful balancing act you have to perform every day. But as soon as you step out, the rules come back. Heavier than your skirts, heavier than the basket you carry to market. If you're a man in this world, the path is so much smoother. You joke with your friends, slap each other on the back, and nobody asks where you were last night or who you walked home after the festival. You have secrets, but nobody's counting. Your laughter is just laughter, not evidence of guilt. But if you're a woman, especially one young enough to still be talked about in terms of purity, you're always on the edge of becoming a story and not the good kind. The double standard isn't just a rumor, it's a wall And you're on the wrong side of it. Let's be honest. Most of the world's laws for most of history weren't written with you in mind. If anything, they were written against you. Medieval legal codes like England's common law or France's Salic law outlined the price of stolen sheep and broken fences in exhausting detail. But when it came to violence against women, things got fuzzy. Here's your mainstream historical fact. In many parts of Europe, rape was treated less as a crime against a person and more as a property crime, an offence against the father, the husband, or the man who owned the woman in question. Her feelings, her pain, not even a line on the parchment. Let's take a case from the 14th century England. A man assaults a young woman in the village green. If she's unmarried, the father sues, not for her suffering, but for damages to his household. If she's married, it's the husband who goes to court, outraged that someone's touched his goods, the girl herself. She stands in the back, eyes lowered, listening to the men argue over how much she's worth now that she's damaged. Historians still argue whether this was just legal convenience or genuine belief. Was a woman really just property? Or did the law pretend she was because it made things easier for men in power? There are thick books on both sides, but the feeling in your gut is the same. You're invisible unless something happens to you, and then you're only visible as a problem to solve. Here's a fringe tidbit that's both ridiculous and sad. In some towns, if a woman was raped, but no harm was done, meaning she didn't get pregnant or die, the court might fine the man a few coins less than what you'd pay for a sheepdog. But if the woman was a noble or from a wealthy family, the fines went up, not because her pain was greater, but because her value to her family was higher, so much for justice being blind. And if the woman was poor or alone or someone without a powerful family, the law barely noticed. You could scream all you wanted, but unless your father or brother could muster up the right paperwork or get the ear of a local lord, nothing happened. In fact, sometimes the law even blamed you, if you didn't cry out loud enough, or if you couldn't prove you fought back. You might be accused of consent, because as everyone knew or pretended to know, a woman can always resist if she wants to. The logic is so twisted it could pass for a village prank, except nobody's laughing. That's the heart of the double standard. Men could walk free, boast, even joke about what they'd done, while women bore the lifelong scars, both seen and unseen. Your father might walk you home. Your brothers might threaten any boy who looks your way. But if something happens, the question is always, what did you do? Where were you? Why didn't you scream louder? And worst of all, were you asking for it? It's not just your body on trial, but your character, your habits, even your walk. Remember that talk about proof of purity? Well, here's another layer. If you were attacked and couldn't prove you resisted with every ounce of your strength, the law might decide you'd secretly wanted it. A real woman, the argument went, would fight to the death rather than give in. And if you survived, maybe you weren't really innocent after all. It's logic that would make a logician weep. But it's the air you breathe. There are jokes, of course, because sometimes you have to laugh or else you'd cry. In some villages, there's a saying, a woman's voice is soft unless she's been wronged. Then suddenly, everyone's deaf. You hear it in the market, whispered between bites of bread, but it's not really funny. Another goes, if the hen crows, the rooster laughs. Translation. If a woman speaks up, the men mock her, or worse, ignore her. It's enough to make you wish you were a rooster. This double standard plays out everywhere, not just in courts and laws, but in daily life. If a man chases you and you run, he's just being a man. If you stand your ground, you're asking for trouble. If you hide, you're paranoid. If you're attacked, you're careless. Heads, he wins. Tails, you lose. Let's talk about punishments for a moment. There were laws, sure, against ravishment, but they were rarely enforced. If the man was rich, he could buy his way out. If he was poor, he might run off to the next town. Sometimes the punishment wasn't for him at all. It was for you. You might be sent away to live with an aunt, forced into a quick marriage, or paraded in front of the parish to confess your shame. Even if the court ruled in your favor, a rare miracle, the damage was done. People remembered, whispered, and never let you forget. Historians still debate whether women really believed the system would protect them. Some say yes. There are records of women who fought for justice, who took their cases to court, who named names even when it cost them everything. Others say no. Most women knew the risks, kept quiet, and prayed nothing would happen. Maybe the truth is somewhere in between. Hope and fear tangled up like last year's yarn. The irony is men's reputations didn't suffer from these crimes. If anything, boasting about conquests, real or invented, could make a man more popular. In the taverns, stories grew with every mug available. If you're a girl overhearing this, you learn quickly to keep your head down, not to challenge, not to ask questions, because if you do, you become a target, a punchline, or a cautionary tale. Still, even in this bleak landscape, there are flashes of resistance. Some families against the odds stand by their daughters. Some women, braver than most, defy the silence. There's a story told in the Low Countries about a baker's daughter who, after being attacked by a noble, refused to marry him even though it would have restored her honor. Instead, she took her case all the way to the city council. Did she win? Historians still argue. Some say she did, forcing the man to pay a real price. Others say she lost, banished to the margins of her town, remembered only as a warning. Either way, the fact that she tried matters. It shows that for all the weight of the double standard, not everyone bowed to it, but for most, survival meant silence. You learn to measure your steps, to calculate the risks, to avoid certain roads after dark. You memorize the faces of safe men and dangerous ones, though sometimes they were the same person, depending on who was watching. You grew up knowing that if the worst happened, you might be blamed for it, and your attacker might walk away with a wink and a joke. There's a cruel comfort in routine. You get up, you do your chores, you play the part everyone expects. You laugh at the right jokes, pretend not to hear the whispers, and hope your story isn't next. But at night, when the house is quiet and the candles have burned down to nubs, you can't help but wonder, what would it be like to live in a world where justice meant something, where the law protected you, not just your father's reputation, where a crime against you was a crime against you, and not just a footnote in someone else's story. Until then, you survive by being invisible, by blending in, by carrying the double standard on your back and pretending it doesn't hurt. It's the world you know, the only one you've got. But sometimes when you look at the stars through your window, you let yourself hope that someday the rules might change, and that girls like you won't have to be so careful just to stay safe. You can smell the bread baking. You can hear the bells ringing faintly from the church across the meadow. But even in this calm, golden morning, there's something else hanging in the air. Something invisible but sharper than smoke. Gossip. It slips under doors, slithers through windows, and settles like dust in every corner of your home, especially when the subject is a girl like you. You don't need to see the mouths moving to know you're being talked about. Sometimes the silence says enough. In this world, gossip isn't just idle chatter, it's currency, it's power. And when the story is about a girl who's been ruined, the value multiplies. You learn early that a reputation can change faster than weather, and that women's names, especially yours, can be dragged through mud without leaving a single footprint. That's the real cruelty. You won't even see it coming. One moment, you're the baker's sweet daughter, and the next, you're that girl. You might wonder how it happens. Sometimes it starts with nothing. A torn hem, a flush too red, or being seen walking too close to a boy after the harvest feast. Sometimes it starts with something far worse, a real violation, a real horror, one you can't say aloud without shaking, but no matter the cause, the outcome's often the same. The whispering starts, heads turn, doors close a little faster when you walk past. Your old friend at the market avoids your eyes. A woman who used to smile now pulls her son behind her. A younger girl you once played with now stares with wide, serious eyes, as if you've caught a disease she doesn't want to catch. In some ways, you have. The disease is shame, and it spreads faster than any illness you've ever known. Here's your mainstream historical fact. In many medieval towns, especially across England and Northern Europe, women accused of indecency or immorality could be subjected to public humiliation. Devices like the scold's bridle, a metal cage fitted over the head and mouth, were used to silence women accused of spreading gossip or being sexually deviant. Ironically, many victims of violence were later punished for speaking out about it. Being harmed wasn't as scandalous as admitting it happened. And here's a grim little fringe detail. In some villages, families would burn the clothing of a girl who had been defiled, hoping that the fire would burn away the shame. A sort of cleansing by proxy. The girl, of course, was never really cleansed, only charred inside and out. So, what happens when the gossip sticks, when the village no longer wants to pretend you're welcome? That's when the true exile begins. It doesn't always look like banishment. No one writes a decree or drums you out of town. You're just not invited anymore. Not to the well, not to the weddings, not to the gossip circles, though you're still their favourite subject. The baker forgets to save your mother's usual loaf. The wash takes a little too long with your linens. People say your name like it's too hot to touch. And if your shame, whether imagined or forced, is tied to something as serious as sexual violence, the effect is even worse. Because even if you scream the truth from the rooftops, the story that spreads is never the one you want. You might say, he attacked me, but they'll say, she was asking for it. You might say, I didn't say yes, but they'll say, then why was she alone with him? Historians still argue whether communities genuinely believed these things or just clung to them because it was easier than facing uncomfortable truths. Some scholars believe that gossip served a social function, policing behavior and reinforcing norms. Others suggest it was a pressure valve, a way for powerless people to exert some form of control in a rigid world. Either way, the result was the same. Women got hurt, and then they got blamed. Sometimes you think about leaving, just grabbing a satchel, walking out, finding a new village where no one knows your name. But it's not that simple. Travel is dangerous, work is scarce. And even if you do make it, your past travels with you. If not in words, then in posture, in hesitation, in the slight quiver in your voice when someone asks where you're from. You don't belong, and you know it. There's an old saying whispered among women in the cloth-dyeing district. Better to carry a bleeding hand than a soiled name, because wounds heal, names don't. Here's a sick little joke that floats around town squares and fire pits. Why did the girl run from the market? Because her name got there before she did. You laugh when you hear it, because everyone else is laughing, but it tastes like ashes in your mouth. You know exactly what that feels like, to walk into a room and feel it contract around you, to sit at a feast and notice the space around your bench widen, to speak and feel the silence stretch just a second too long before anyone answers. What's worse is the way the blame reshapes you. You start second-guessing your steps. Was your smile too wide? Did your dress show too much? Should you have taken the long way home, even if it meant walking in the dark? The shame warps time itself. You relive moments over and over trying to find the mistake, even if the only mistake was someone else's violence. Your own mother might look at you differently, not out of cruelty, but out of helplessness. She doesn't know what to do with this version of you, the one they whisper about. She might hug you tighter or barely touch you at all. Her silence, once comforting, becomes suffocating. And if you're lucky enough to have siblings, especially younger sisters, their lives might change too. Some suitors stop coming around, some jobs don't get offered. The shadow of your shame stretches further than your own doorstep. It settles on your whole family, which makes some of them bitter. They don't blame you, not openly, but resentment simmers, so you retreat. You do your chores quietly. You speak only when spoken to. You stop looking people in the eye. You become your own ghost. Still living, still breathing, but no longer really present. There's a strange sort of sisterhood among the exiled. You find others eventually. A widow whose husband left mysteriously. A girl who went to the city and came back older, harder. A midwife who doesn't ask questions and never repeats a name. Together you form a new kind of village, one made not of wood and stone, but of shared silence and quiet strength. You learn how to carry yourself differently. You trade tips about which routes avoid the worst gossips. You learn the value of blending in, of becoming unremarkable. You stop wearing the colors you loved. You tie your hair up tighter. You make yourself forgettable until someone needs your story again. Because here's the cruel twist. The gossip doesn't fade when you're quiet. It waits. It hibernates. And the moment someone else stumbles, it wakes up. She's like that girl. They'll say, "Remember her?" And just like that, your name is back in circulation. Not because you did anything new, just because you never really left. Historians still debate how women survived this cycle. Some turned to religion, joining convents where silence was spiritual and shame was swept under ritual. Others married the first man who would have them, no matter how cruel or dull. Some disappeared altogether, their names scratched off records, their stories ending mid-sentence. And a few, just a few, found a way to live on the edges, crafting new identities, becoming healers or merchants or travelers, but always with shadows in tow. There's no redemption arc here, not yet. Just a slow, bitter lesson that in this world your greatest crime may be being seen, being talked about, being known. So when you walk home tonight and the wind carries the soft buzz of voices behind closed doors, you wrap your shawl a little tighter. You don't cry, you don't run, you just walk, you survive. You're standing in a cramped, cold room that smells of ink, sweat, and something metallic. Blood, maybe, or just the rusted hinges on the courtroom door. You're not the accused, not officially. You're the one seeking justice. the one who was wronged. But from the way everyone's looking at you, from the scribe scratching notes to the bath with his lazy scowl, you'd think you were on trial. Welcome to the medieval justice system. It's not a place of fairness or healing. It's a theatre. And today, you're centre stage. If something terrible happens to you, if someone attacks you, forces themselves on you, you're told to go to the authorities. But the moment you walk through those doors, everything flips. The courtroom becomes a gauntlet, and you're expected to explain in excruciating detail not what he did, but what you were doing, where you were, what you wore, whether you screamed, whether anyone heard, whether you resisted, whether you bled. And if you didn't do all those things in the right order, well, maybe it wasn't really a crime. Maybe it was just a misunderstanding. Maybe you regretted it afterward. Maybe, as the judges have seen so many times before, you're just trying to cover up your own shame. This is the cruel game women are forced to play, and it's rigged before the dice even roll. Here's your mainstream historical fact. In many medieval European courts, a woman alleging rape had to prove that she had cried out during the act loud enough for others to hear, and that she had raised the alarm as soon as possible afterward. If she didn't or couldn't, her case might be dismissed outright, even if the man confessed, even if there were witnesses, even if her body told a silent but clear story. Historians still argue whether these requirements were sincere attempts to prevent false accusations or just thin veils for a system deeply invested in protecting male privilege. Some legal scholars note how rarely rape convictions occurred, even when there was overwhelming evidence. Others point out that male reputation, especially among the upper class, was treated as more fragile and precious than a woman's body. You shift in the witness box, if your village even has one, and the questions come fast and sharp. Did you scream? Did you fight? Why were you there in the first place? Were you walking alone? Did he promise you anything? Were you drinking? Did you flirt? Did you smile? And most importantly, do you have witnesses? And of course you don't. Who would be with you in that moment except the person who hurt you? The law pretends to care about justice, but in practice, it only cares about proof, not the bruises blooming on your skin or the crack in your voice. Proof, by their standards, means witnesses, torn garments, loud public resistance, and above all, no previous rumor or reputation that suggests you might have invited what happened. If you'd ever been seen laughing with the accused, that's noted. If you ever accepted a gift that's entered into evidence, if you'd ever looked too pretty on market day, well, that says something, doesn't it? You're not just telling your story, you're auditioning for sympathy. Here's a fringe tidbit. In the 15th century Flanders, some courts required a physical inspection of a woman's body to confirm whether rape had occurred, often conducted by male physicians or churchmen. These inspections were rarely accurate, frequently humiliating, and almost never resulted in justice for the victim. Worse, if your body didn't match what the law thought rape looked like, your case could be thrown out on the spot. And then, of course, there's the issue of character, because in many courts, a woman's prior behavior could be used against her, even if completely unrelated. Had she spoken out of turn? Had she been loose with her words or friends? Had she ever been accused of immoral conduct before? If so, her testimony was considered less reliable. If you were seen as impure, loud, or independent, your credibility shrank by the minute. Men, on the other hand, were rarely asked to prove anything. If the accused was a nobleman or had ties to powerful people, he might not even show up to court. He'd send someone in his place, a steward or cousin, with a purse full of coins and a letter of apology. If he did attend, He'd stand tall and composed, surrounded by friends who vouched for his character. He'd never do such a thing, they'd say. He's a man of honor. You're standing alone. Maybe your mother's behind you weeping. Maybe your father's angry, not at the man who hurt you, but at you for bringing this shame into the open. Maybe you're too numb to even care what they think anymore. Sometimes your best option, your only option, is to settle, not for justice, but for a marriage. That's right. In many cases, a man accused of rape could avoid punishment by agreeing to marry the woman. It was seen as a way to repair the damage, to make her respectable again. You're expected to be grateful. After all, you've landed a husband. Never mind that he forced himself on you. Never mind that you never wanted him in the first place. The marriage is a bandage slapped over an open wound, and you're expected to smile through the pain. Historians still debate whether women had any real agency in accepting these settlements. Some point to letters and records showing that women resisted, refused, and fought back. Others argue that the pressure from families and communities made such resistance nearly impossible. Either way, the pattern is clear. Justice is something you dream about. Survival is what you get. The trial ends. Maybe the man walks free. Maybe he pays a fine. Maybe he marries you. But whatever the outcome, you're the one who carries it. The eyes in the village shift when you pass. Some look away, some stare too long. You're marked not by what you did, but by what was done to you. There's an old joke women whisper behind closed doors. Better to face the wolves in the woods than the judges in town. Because at least the wolves don't ask what you are wearing. You return home, not a victor, not vindicated, but tired. So tired. You try to fall asleep, but your mind replays every question, every look, every sigh. You try to forget the way the judge furrowed his brow. You try to ignore the doubt in your cousin's voice when she said, "Are you sure it happened like that?" And you wonder, what if you hadn't come forward? Would it have been easier? Would you still have your name, your friends, your place at the feast table? Would you still be someone who smiled without thinking? Then you remember the faces of the other women, the ones who didn't speak up, the ones who disappeared, the ones who married their silence. And you realize you're not alone. Even if the courtroom made you feel like you were. You're part of a long line of women who are blamed for being broken, who are asked to prove pain, to document horror, to explain why they didn't die fighting. You're part of a story that stretches across centuries, written in whispers and tear-stained testimony. So no, maybe the court didn't believe you, maybe the town talks, maybe your father barely looks at you anymore, but you spoke, you named him, you didn't let it stay a secret, and maybe, just maybe, that matters more than they'll ever admit. You lie awake, staring at the ceiling, and you promise yourself you will not vanish, you will not be erased. And one day, if not for you, then for another girl. You hope the story ends differently. You wake with a headache, nothing serious, just the dull kind that comes from holding your jaw too tight, grinding your teeth against fear in your sleep. The house is still. The ashes in the hearth whisper that the fire went out long before midnight. You lie still for a moment and think, as you've done too often lately, what if they're right? What if it was my fault? That's the most dangerous part of this world. Not the threats you can see, but the ones that take root in your own mind. And medicine, or what passes for it here, doesn't help. In fact, it makes things worse. You don't know a word for trauma. You don't know the terms fight or flight or victim blaming or psychological distress. What you know is what the healers tell you, that your humors are unbalanced. that your womb is wandering, that your own body might have wanted what happened. Yes, you heard that right. In the medieval worldview, the body, especially a woman's body, was a mysterious, unstable thing. Doctors, and by doctors we mean mostly men, with books copied from other men's books, believed that a woman's physiology was ruled by moisture and cold, by passivity and emptiness. They said your womb could literally roam through your body, causing hysteria. They said that if your body reacted to touch, any touch, it was proof that you must have wanted it. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Well into the Renaissance, influential medical texts like those of Hippocrates and Galen were still used across Europe. These works taught that women were biologically inferior, less rational, more emotional, and more susceptible to bodily imbalance. It wasn't just wrong, it was dangerous, because when you're assaulted and your body goes numb or still, they interpret that stillness not as terror, but as consent. And here's a truly bizarre fringe tidbit. In the 13th century, medical tracts from France, some healers wrote that rape couldn't result in pregnancy because conception, they said, required pleasure. So if a woman became pregnant, it was used as evidence that she must have enjoyed it. Try arguing with that kind of logic when you're 17, scared, and staring down a man in a robe who smells like herbs and smugness. Historians still argue whether these beliefs were sincerely held or whether they were weaponized intentionally to excuse male violence. Some say the ignorance was genuine, just men fumbling in the dark, guessing about women's bodies. Others point to how conveniently these theories absolved rapists and silenced victims. After all, if women were naturally prone to desire, chaos, and confusion, how could you ever take their word for what happened? So, when you go to the village healer after something terrible, you don't get comfort. You get a lecture about your moist temperament. You're given bitter herbs to cool the blood or quieten the womb. You're told to fast, to pray, to avoid red meat and music. Maybe you're bled, because of course the answer to your violation is to drain you further. And if you cry, that's hysteria. If you tremble, that's a sign of internal imbalance. If you stay silent, you're withholding the truth. If you speak too much, you're clearly exaggerating. You can't win. The body that was taken from you is now being interpreted by men who believe it speaks a language only they can read. And don't think the church doesn't get involved. They're just as eager to pathize you. Your soul is wounded, the priest might say, but so is your flesh. He'll recommend penance, maybe a pilgrimage, maybe a vow of silence, anything it seems but justice. Let's pause for a joke because, as you know by now, if we don't laugh, we break. In one old Italian manuscript, a physician claims that too much reading can cause a woman's uterus to heat up and lead her into immoral behavior. So next time you're tempted to crack open a book, maybe put on some gloves. You wouldn't want your uterus getting any ideas, but the joke wears thin because you realize that none of this is meant to help you. It's meant to explain you away. Your pain becomes a puzzle for others to solve, not a truth to be honored. Your testimony is suspect because your biology is suspect. You're not rational, you're not reliable, you're not even entirely human, not in the eyes of the court, the doctor, or the church. Your friends whisper stories of other girls who were sent to convents after assaults, not for healing, but to keep them quiet. You learn to watch your tone, to feign health, even when you're breaking. You don't flinch when people touch you, even though your skin wants to crawl away. You learn to perform normality. You try to forget what the midwife said last week, that your pulse seemed too warm. that you need to pray more, that perhaps your dreams are inviting something darker, and you think, if I'd been born a man, would they say the same? Of course not. Men's bodies are not questioned. Men's feelings are not pathized. When men lash out, they're driven. When women break down, they're unbalanced. Historians still argue how much women internalize this. Some say medieval women believed deeply in humoral medicine and saw themselves as biologically flawed. Others argue women privately rejected these ideas even if they had to pretend to agree publicly. Either way, you're left with the residue of it, the sense that somehow your body betrayed you. So you become afraid of yourself, you mistrust your own memories, you start to believe that maybe you did walk too fast, smile too long, linger too late. You replay it all, looking for a clue. The medicine men and priests and whispering midwives have done their work well. You're not just hurt. You're unsure if you're allowed to be hurt. There's a saying from an old nun passed around in quiet moments. If pain must be holy, let mine be blasphemy. You don't fully understand what it means at first, but it rattles around in your brain for days. Then it hits you. Maybe you don't have to sanctify this. Maybe your pain is real, human, and not something that needs to be explained away with herbs, prayers, or guilt. But the village isn't ready for that. So you swallow the bitterness, both literal and metaphorical. You go to the healer when you must, but you don't expect healing. You go to the priest, but you say only the bare minimum. You keep your eyes down, your mouth shut, your stories folded tight inside you, because the only thing more dangerous than being broken in this world is trying to explain how. The bell rings out over the fields again, low and solemn, as if even it knows to be gentle today. You pull your shawl tighter around your shoulders and join the slow stream of bodies heading toward the chapel. Church is mandatory, of course, not just for your soul, but for your reputation. Skipping Mass is as suspicious as wearing lipstick to a funeral. So you go. Everyone does. The stone building looms like a warning more than a welcome. It's colder inside than it is outdoors, and the air smells of candle wax, damp wood, and something more ancient, like secrets buried under the flagstones. You step inside and instantly feel smaller. The women huddle to one side, the men to the other. The priest's voice rises over your bowed head, solemn and assured, as if every word has been written directly by God himself. And in a way they have, or so you're told. In this world, the church is more than a place of worship. It's a courtroom, a doctor's office, a therapist's chair, and a prison cell, all rolled into one. It tells you who you are, what you're worth, what you can hope for after this life, and most pressingly, whether what happened to you was a sin, not his sin, yours. Here's your mainstream historical fact. For much of the Middle Ages, the Christian Church held that sexual sin, even when forced, could be spiritually damaging to the victim. Though canon law technically recognized rape as a crime, confessionals often treated survivors not as the wronged, but as the fallen. A woman who was raped might be required to confess and perform penance, just as if she had consented. The logic was cruelly twisted. Even unwilling involvement in carnal acts was seen as a stain on the soul. You're told to kneel, so you kneel, not for healing, but for forgiveness for something you never asked for. The priest doesn't shout, he doesn't scold, but his voice is heavy. He reminds you that your body is a temple and that it's your duty to keep it pure. He talks about temptation and shame, about guarding yourself against sin. And you realize he's not speaking to the men behind you. His eyes keep flicking forward to the girls. The message is clear. If anything happens to you, it must be because you weren't devout enough. You didn't pray hard enough. You didn't keep your virtue close enough. Historians still argue how uniform these teachings were, whether rural priests were more forgiving than urban ones, whether nuns offered gentler counsel than monks, but the larger truth remains. The dominant Christian doctrine placed the burden of sexual purity squarely on women's shoulders. Men, if they sinned, could repent. Women were supposed to prevent the sin from happening at all. Here's a darkly absurd fringe tidbit. Some monasteries kept lists of women considered spiritually compromised due to rumors of sexual misconduct. These women were often refused entry into convents, even if they had been victims of violence, because even among the cloistered, purity was currency. You sit on the hard bench and listen as the priest reads the story of Mary Magdalene. He talks about redemption, about transformation, about rising from sin to become holy. It sounds hopeful, but it's not because the church always prefers its redeemed women broken first. If you're hurt but not humbled, you're dangerous. The sermon moves on. He speaks of hellfire, of damnation, of the eyes of God watching even the most secret acts. You feel your skin crawl. You wonder if he saw what happened. You wonder if he judged you too. And here comes the whispered joke of the week. Because even under this granite ceiling of judgment, people still find ways to laugh. One of the girls near the back mutters, "If God didn't see it, the priest surely did." A sharp elbow in the ribs quiets her, but the smile flickers briefly. It's a bitter sort of defiance, a spark in the ash. After the sermon, you're expected to confess. The wooden booth cacks as you slide inside the priest, hidden behind a carved screen. You don't say everything, how could you? But you say enough. You tell him you felt dirty, that you've doubted yourself, that you wonder if your soul is stained. He listens, he sighs, he assigns prayers, penance, no outrage, no righteous fury, just the dull rustle of beads and breath. You leave the booth no lighter than before. Historians still debate how priests truly viewed these confessions. Were they numb to them, trained to prioritize the ritual move of the person, or did they carry the weight of these stories in silence, unable or unwilling to challenge the larger dogma? Either way, the silence is the loudest thing in church. No one speaks of these things directly. They use euphemisms, a fall, a slip, a stain on the soul, and always the responsibility is yours. If you were truly innocent, they say God would have protected you. If you weren't, well, this is what happens to girls who stray from virtue. There's a cruel neatness to it, a spiritual trap with no way out. Because even if you believe in your own innocence, the structure around you doesn't. And slowly, piece by piece, you stop believing too. Your mother tells you to pray more. Your father tells you to stay inside. Your friends stop visiting, afraid of being seen with a fallen girl. The church says you can find redemption, but only if you accept your sin. But what if you didn't sin? What if you were just there, just breathing, just existing? Too bad. In the eyes of the church, sin stains on contact. You can either bleach yourself with guilt or be cast out entirely. And so, like many before you, you embrace the silence, not because it's peaceful, but because it's safer. You bow your head when they speak. You mumble your prayers. You count your rosary beads and try not to let your hands shake. You stop asking questions. You stop expecting answers. Until one day, you hear a different voice. Maybe it's a nun in the garden who lets you stay longer than you're supposed to. Maybe it's an old widow who remembers her own silence. Maybe it's someone unexpected, a younger girl who hasn't yet learned the rules, who asks too many questions, who hasn't been broken yet. And in that moment, you feel a flicker of something dangerous. Not anger, not defiance, hope. Because not everyone accepts this system. Not everyone believes pain is sin. Not everyone thinks silence is sacred. Historians still argue whether these small rebellions, these murmured rejections of doctrine, actually changed anything, but they existed. Letters between nuns show compassion that contradicted official teachings. Some women recorded their suffering in secret journals, refusing to let the church define their truth. Others simply survived quietly. Stubbornly, without ever bowing their heads, you rise from the pew and walk out into the sunlight. The bells toll again, the town goes on, but something inside you has shifted. You're not healed. You're not free. But for the first time, you're not alone in your silence. And maybe that's enough for now. You keep your head down as you walk past the market, past the well, past the spots where laughter used to bloom like clover in spring. The chatter fades behind you, some of it about prices, some of it about crops, and some of it, you're sure, still about you. You used to join in those conversations. You used to wave, ask about people's children, trade flour for herbs. Now you keep walking. You've learned the art of vanishing in plain sight. But the strangest thing, you're not the only one doing it. In every town, every village, every quiet corner of this medieval world, there are women walking like ghosts among the living. Not pale or spectral, no, but carrying something invisible just under the skin. Pain that doesn't show up in bruises, fear that doesn't always have a reason, grief that was never given a funeral. You learn slowly to recognize the signs, the flinch when a man speaks too loudly, the way some girls avoid the church steps, the careful glances passed between older women like coded messages, and silence. It's not that the world doesn't know what happens, it's that it prefers not to admit it. Everyone knows someone who left suddenly. Everyone remembers a girl who got herself into trouble. Everyone's heard whispers about why a certain woman never married, or why she never had children, or why she moved to the far side of the village and keeps her shutters closed. It's all very proper and polite on the surface. But beneath it is a running river of secrets everyone steps around. That's what makes it so insidious. The wounds are open secrets. You're hurt, but you're not allowed to say so, or rather, you're allowed but not welcomed. So, most of you learn to tuck it away. You still go to festivals, but you don't dance. You still go to the well, but you let others speak first. You still show up to Mass, but your eyes are on the stones beneath your feet. People might not say your name anymore, but they remember, and they treat you just slightly differently. Here's your mainstream historical fact. In medieval England and parts of continental Europe, victims of sexual violence, especially if the case wasn't prosecuted, were often quietly excluded from certain social roles, including midwifery, caregiving, and religious orders. A woman's perceived purity wasn't just a personal issue, it determined her social function. Even when no charges were brought, the stain of accusation lingered like smoke in a straw roof. But here's a strange and unexpected fringe tidbit. In the 14th century Paris, women who were attacked could, in rare cases, request a scarlet veil to wear in public, a kind of symbolic marker that they were not to be shamed because what happened had been verified. The idea was meant to protect them from gossip. But you can imagine how well that worked. A red veil in a town that thrives on whispers, it might as well have been a target. Historians still argue whether silence was truly the only option for most women. Some point to court records and letters that show women did speak up, often fiercely, naming names and demanding justice. But the cost of doing so was high. And for many, the safer path was invisibility. So you live two lives. One is the life you show, neat hair, calm voice, quiet chores. The other is the one you carry. Sleepless nights, a heartbeat that skips when you hear heavy boots, memories you can't name because there are no words for them yet. You remember when you used to dream about love, about a family, about being seen, not as a risk or a problem, but as someone. You remember how you used to laugh without checking who was watching. Now even your joy feels like a secret. And yet, even in the silence, you're not alone. There's the girl who sits next to you at Mass and touches your hand for just a second too long. There's the older woman who gives you extra bread without asking questions. There's the midwife who doesn't blink when you flinch, who gives you herbs, not to silence you, but to steady you. These are not grand gestures, but they are lifelines. There's an old rhyme you hear in the spinning rooms whispered among women bent over wool and grief. We speak no names, we stitch no tears, but all our silence, someone hears. It makes you want to cry, and you almost do, except the girl next to you is watching, and you know how important it is for her to see you strong. This is how you survive, by building quiet bridges to other ghosts, by leaving bread at someone's door who won't speak to you but always takes it, by learning which songs are safe to hum and which ones open wounds too deep to close. Sometimes you imagine screaming, telling the whole town, demanding they see what they've done, what they've allowed. You picture their faces, shocked and ashamed, as you call out every lie, every sideways glance, every cruel joke. But you never do, not because you're weak, but because you know how the world works. It doesn't reward truth-tellers, it punishes them. Still, there are tiny rebellions. You start walking taller. You look certain men in the eye. You answer questions without apology, You help the next girl find her footing before she falls into the same silence you did. Historians still debate how much women supported each other in these times. Some argue that the pressure to conform made them complicit in their own silencing. Others suggest that within those constraints, women formed underground networks of care, resistance, and remembrance. You like to believe the latter because even now you can feel it. The quiet ways women hold each other up. Like the woman who loans you her shawl on a cold night, not just for warmth, but as a signal that she sees you. Like the girl who pretends not to notice your shaking hands when you pass her a ladle. Like the nun who lets you stay after Mass and light candles in silence, saying nothing, asking nothing, but letting you breathe. These are the moments that rebuild you, not all at once, but piece by piece. You begin to wonder if maybe this silence isn't just erasure. Maybe it's a language, one only women speak fluently. A language of glances, gestures, kindnesses that require no permission. And maybe one day that language will change. Maybe one day someone will find the words you couldn't say. Maybe there will be a world where women who are hurt are helped, not hidden. But for now, there's work to do, there's bread to bake, there's firewood to gather, there's a life to live, even if it feels like a shadow of the one you once hoped for. So you move forward. Scarred, yes, but not erased. The day starts like any other. The smell of porridge clings to the air. The dog barks at passing carts, but something's off. You notice it in the way your mother avoids your eyes, the way your younger brother keeps glancing at you, and then glancing away like he's seen something he wasn't supposed to. Then your father walks in tight-lipped, and you know something's been decided. Something about you. He clears his throat. Your mother folds her hands, and they tell you without asking that you're going to be married. You blink. You don't know whether to cry or laugh. Married after everything to who? They tell you his name. Maybe it's the man who hurt you. Maybe it's someone older or someone poor and desperate enough to marry a girl with a past. Maybe it's someone who doesn't even want a wife, just a servant. But one thing's for certain, he's not marrying you. He's marrying your silence, your family's second chance. Because in this world, marriage is the only redemption ticket available. If you've been shamed violently, tragically, or even just by rumor, the path back to respectability is narrow and steep, and it always goes through someone else's house. Here's your mainstream historical fact. In medieval Europe, particularly in England, France, and Italy, the most common resolution for accusations of rape was for the perpetrator to marry the victim, especially if she was no longer considered marriageable due to the assault. This was legally codified in many places, including the Norman laws in England. The logic was horrifyingly simple. Her virginity was her value, and if that was taken, then the only way to make her whole again was to restore her status through marriage. Your father explains this without saying it outright. He uses words like stability and future and honor. But what he means is this will make the neighbor stop talking. What he means is if you marry him, it's over. As if that's a comfort. And your mother, she's crying, but she doesn't stop it. She wrings her hands and says, he's not so bad. She tells you how hard life would be otherwise, how few options you have now. And when you protest, if you do, she tells you not to be ungrateful. At least he wants you, she says. At least someone still wants you. It's a sharp thing, that line, and it cuts deep, because the truth is, most men wouldn't. Not after what happened. Whether you chose it or not, whether you were assaulted, seduced, or simply accused, the result is the same. You're a damaged good, a cracked pot on the merchant shelf, only fit for those with few choices and fewer scruples. Here's a fringe historical tidbit. In some Mediterranean villages, families would stage elaborate false ceremonies to make it look like a marriage had taken place, even if it hadn't, just to cover a scandal. In one case, a puppet was used to stand in for a groom who had fled after the assault. The girl was then declared a widow and sent away. That was the compromise, a fake marriage to a fake man, because the idea of the union mattered more than her actual life. Historians still argue whether these marriages helped or harmed women long term. Some women did manage to build quiet lives with men who, though not kind, were not cruel. Others lived in fear, trapped with their abusers. A few escaped entirely, choosing poverty or exile over submission, but the official story was always the same. She was married, therefore she was fine. You're not fine. The day of the wedding arrives quickly, You don't get the lace, the music, or the smiling faces. You get a hasty ceremony in the shadow of the altar, performed more for paperwork than celebration. The priest blesses the union, never once asking if you want it. Consent isn't really a requirement when you've already been ruined. People attend, of course, not because they're happy for you, but because weddings, even grim ones, are events. The whispers return. She's lucky, someone says. At least she's not on the streets. You stand still in your borrowed dress, your stomach twisting as the man places a ring on your finger. It's not a symbol of love, it's a lock. Later that night, in the dark room that isn't yours, you lie awake beside the man who now calls you wife. Maybe he's silent, maybe he touches you, maybe he doesn't. But the worst part, you thank God if he ignores you, because at least then the humiliation is quieter. From now on, your shame wears a new name. You're no longer that girl, you're his wife. It's supposed to be a promotion. It feels more like a sentence. You go through the motions, you cook, you clean, you nod at the neighbors who nod back just a little too late. You smile at their children and keep yours close, and over time the world settles into a new pattern. The whispers fade, not because they've forgiven you, but because the spectacle has passed. Your scandal has become a fact, like a broken fence no one bothers to fix. Some women settle into this life like dust. Others resist in small, invisible ways. They stop answering, they refuse touch, they retreat into themselves, into faith, or bitterness, or just plain numbness. There's a joke half said and never laughed at. Marriage cures everything but memory. You learn to carry yours quietly. Historians still debate whether these coerced marriages were considered valid by the church. Some theologians wrote that a marriage under duress was not spiritually binding, but in practice no one asked the girl. Once the ceremony was done, so was the debate. But even in this place, some women find power. A few become mistresses of their homes. They control the purse strings. They raise their daughters with sharper warnings and softer hands. Some outlive their husbands and emerge into widowhood with a new name, not shamed, not broken, just still here. It's not justice, but it's something. And sometimes, rarely, love grows in the soil of pain. A man marries a girl and learns too late the depth of her wound. And maybe slowly he listens. Maybe he makes space. Maybe the silence between them turns over years into trust. But this is not a common story, and it's never promised. So you live married, but not healed, not rescued, just rebranded. You wake each morning and count the things that are still yours. The small patch of garden where you grow herbs. The way the sunlight hits the wall just before noon. The softness of your child's hair. These are your anchors. These are your truths. Because in a world that calls survival scandal, endurance becomes resistance. And though you were married to erase your past, you remember. You refuse to forget. You tuck your story into lullabies, into recipes, into the rhythm of your work. You pass it down not as a curse, but as a warning. And when your daughter asks someday why certain doors stay locked, or why her mother stares too long into the fire, you will tell her not everything, but enough. Enough for her to know that shame is not inherited. Enough for her to know that being silenced is not the same as being wrong. And maybe, just maybe, that will be the start of a different kind of story. The day your husband dies, they say you should grieve. And maybe you do, but grief, in your case, is complicated. You sit in the corner of the one-room house you shared, now silent, now yours, and realize that this is the first time in years you can breathe without bracing. The neighbors come, they mutter prayers, they leave bread and broth. But beneath their condolences is something colder, something older than sorrow, suspicion. Because now you're a widow, and in this world that means something different than just a woman who's lost her husband. It means you're unanchored, unclaimed, unwatched. And that's dangerous. At first you don't see it. You're too busy sweeping floors, answering the endless questions about funeral arrangements, inheritance, whether you'll remarry. People pat your hand and ask what you'll do next, as if it's a choice, as if any of this ever was. But behind the pity is something sharper. Fear, curiosity, a quiet threat. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Widows in medieval Europe occupied a uniquely precarious position. While the church praised chastity and independence, society often treated widows with suspicion. Without a husband to control them, widows were seen as morally ambiguous, potentially manipulative, and sometimes dangerous. In many places, they were legally barred from owning property outright, and social acceptance depended entirely on their behavior and how quiet they remained. You're not rich, but you have enough to get by. Your late husband left you a corner of land and a few goats. For the first time in your life, your days are yours. You rise when you choose. You eat alone. You speak without seeking permission. And the freedom feels intoxicating than terrifying, because people notice. They notice that you walk differently now, that your hair, once kept tucked under scarf and bonnet, sometimes spills loose, that you speak your mind more than you used to. And in a world built on hierarchy and obedience, a woman who doesn't ask is a woman to be watched. You start hearing the whispers again. She doesn't seem very sad. She's doing well, too well. She's always been strange. Strange. It's the word they use when they can't accuse, but they still want to warn. It's the word before dangerous, the word before witch. You'd think being called a witch would require cauldrons and curses, but no. All it takes is solitude, a little too much knowledge, a little too much control. Here's a bitterly fascinating fringe tidbit. In some regions of 15th century Germany and Switzerland, widows made up a disproportionate number of women accused of witchcraft. Not because they cast spells, but because they didn't fit. They lived alone, they spoke plainly, they owned land, and they didn't need permission to exist. Historians still argue whether these witch hunts were truly about religion or simply a convenient way to remove difficult women from society, likely both. The line between piety and paranoia was thin, and power has always had a knack for cloaking itself in righteousness. So, what do? You try to fit again. You lower your eyes at market. You wear darker colors. You overpay the priest to light a candle in your husband's name. You help other women birth their babies and never speak of the herbs you use. But it doesn't matter, because once the whispers begin, they rarely stop. A cow dies. The widow's been walking past the pastor at dusk. A man gets sick. She gave him tea last week. A storm hits the village. She hasn't been to church in days. It's absurd, but it's also effective, because soon you're no longer just a widow. You're a warning. The lesson young girls are taught without needing to say the words. Don't be like her. So, you retreat further. You lock your doors. You stop smiling at children. You stop visiting the market. You grow your food, stitch your clothes, light your fire and wait. You live in silence, but inside your mind, you're loud. You remember everything. The man who hurt you, the town that ignored it, the marriage that buried your voice, the years you survived with your head down and your mouth shut. And now finally alone, you think, what if I stop pretending I'm not angry? Because you are angry at the laws, the church, the men who lied, the women who stayed silent, the endless ways in which your body has been used, judged, redeemed, discarded. There's a joke you hear from the old women on the village edge, the ones who've stopped bothering with niceties. A man dies and leaves behind a widow. A woman dies and leaves behind a parable. It sticks with you because you've become a story again, but this time you get to decide what kind. Some nights you lean into it. You let the candlelight flicker against the walls just so. You keep your herbs in plain view. You answer questions with riddles. You say things like, be careful walking home. It's a bad night for liars. Not because you believe in spells, but because they do, and fear, you've learned, is a kind of power. Historians still debate whether the witches of medieval Europe truly saw themselves that way. Some likely did. Others were midwives, healers, lonely women with too much knowledge and too little protection. But many, like you, were simply survivors, marked by pain, turned into monsters by the people who couldn't understand them. Eventually, the town forgets or pretends to. A new scandal, takes over, a merchant is robbed, a tax is raised, a plague breaks out, and you're no longer the subject of every whisper, but they still don't knock on your door. And honestly, you don't miss them because solitude, once feared, has become a sanctuary. You don't have to explain yourself. You don't have to shrink. You don't have to smile when your heart is broken. You live. And for the first time, you live your life. You become the woman girls visit in secret, the one who listens without judgment, who treats bruises with salves and shame with silence, who teaches them how to say no, not out loud, not yet, but in their hearts. And when someone tries to shame them, they remember you. They remember the woman who wore the name widow like armor, the woman who took every label they gave her, ruined wife, witch, and made it into something else, something stronger, something dangerous. The difference starts with shoes. You notice them before anything else. Soft leather, not the stiff patch kind you wear. These glide over mud like they've never seen a day of work. The girl who wears them doesn't look at you. She walks past with her head high, veiled just sheer enough to show her cheekbones, but not her expression. When people gossip about her, it sounds like envy. When they gossip about you, it sounds like judgment. This is the quiet law of class. You're both women, you're both watched, but one of you can afford to be seen. If you're poor, your value lies in your silence, your labor, your ability to keep your body out of scandal. But if you're wealthy, there's room for nuance. Your mistakes are mishaps, your violations are tragedies. You might still be whispered about, but they whisper with pity. They say, what a shame, not what a waste. Here's your mainstream historical fact. In many medieval societies, a woman's class had everything to do with how her reputation, especially around sexual transgression, was handled. Wealthy women had family influence, dowries, and legal leverage that often protected them from social destruction. Poorer women had none of these, and so their respectability could vanish in a single rumor. Let's say something happens, the same something that's happened to women for centuries, an unwanted touch, an assault, a loss of control. If you're poor, you report it and they scoff. If you're rich, you report it and they mourn. If you say nothing, the poor girl is blamed for being careless. The rich one is applauded for her grace. The town remembers your skirts, hers, her eyes. Even the law bends. Wealth buys better scribes, more persuasive witnesses, more forgiving judgments. It's not about truth, it's about framing. And here's a quietly devastating fringe tidbit. In the 14th century Florence, upper-class women accused of indecency could make a public donation to the church to restore their good name, a literal transaction. Give alms, say prayers, and your honor is reinstated. The poor, of course, could offer only their silence. Historians still argue whether class determined survival more than gender in medieval courts. Some suggest that a poor man might face harsher punishment than a noble woman. Others maintain that women, regardless of wealth, were still shackled to expectations of chastity. But there's no doubt that money softened shame and sometimes erased it altogether. So you learn to watch for details, a woman's jewelry, the embroidery on her veil, the way people pause before addressing her. These are the signals of who can make mistakes and who cannot. You remember one day, in particular, a nobleman's daughter is found crying behind the chapel, her dress torn, her cheek red. No one accuses her of seduction. No one asks why she was alone. The priest gathers her in silence. Her mother weeps with purpose. By dusk, her attacker has been exiled, and she's kept indoors for healing. Now picture the same scene, but with you. No fancy dress, no father with coin, just you and your bruises and a story no one wants to hear. You'd be told to hush, to not cause trouble, to marry quickly and forget. You're not angry at her. Not exactly. It's not her fault she was born on silk sheets. But you're angry at the world that decided you must suffer alone while she gets protection. There's a cruel kind of order to it all. People say women are irrational, ruled by emotion. But the systems built around you are nothing if not calculated. Shame is distributed with precision. Pain is privatized for the poor and sanitized for the rich. Still, the rich women are not free, not really. Their worlds are gilded cages. Their marriages are contracts. Their futures depend on obedience just as much as yours. Only the language is different. Where you're expected to be quiet, they are expected to be gracious. Where you must endure, they must perform. You once saw a noble woman cry during Mass, her hands shaking under lace gloves. No one noticed, or rather they noticed, but interpreted it as devotion. Had it been you, they call it hysteria. Even your grief is classed. Still, some rich women break the rules. You hear stories. A baroness who fled her estate, a merchant's daughter who disguised herself as a servant and ran off with a brewer. These women are rare and they're almost always romanticized, turned into ballads, stripped of the messy truth. You wonder if they were happy or if they simply traded one cage for another. There's a quiet joke the washerwomen tell, usually over wineskins when the husbands are asleep. The rich get scandal, the poor get sin. You laugh, but you know it's true. A noble woman caught kissing a knight is called passionate. You'd be called ruinous. But despite everything, you're not bitter all the time. You admire the women who walk with freedom, even if it's bought. You study how they carry themselves, how they demand space instead of shrinking to fit it. And you wonder if your life had been different, would you have walked that way too? You begin to notice something else. Some of these women, despite the boundaries of their station, are watching you, not with judgment, with recognition. One market day, a merchant's wife slips you a sprig of rosemary, not for cooking, but for remembrance. You don't speak, you just nod. And in that moment, there's no distance between you. Historians still debate whether cross-class alliances between women were real or imagined, whether poor and rich women truly formed friendships, or whether their lives remained too divided. But in the cracks of the system, you've seen kindness that defies the rules. A noble woman who paid a midwife to help a servant girl, a lady of the manor who let a bruised girl sleep in her stables until the rumors passed. These are not acts of rebellion, they're acts of refusal, a refusal to let wealth be the only armor. And you too learn to refuse in your own way. You may not have coin, but you have memory. You have a voice. You have stories. And when the time comes, you share them with girls at the well, with women who've just buried their shame under wedding veils, with old widows who hum lullabies of things they'll never say out loud. Together, you rewrite the rules, not in law, but in lineage. You teach your daughter that dignity doesn't come from fabric or formality. It comes from endurance, from knowing the worth of your own skin. And maybe one day when a nobleman's son looks at her too long, she'll look back and say, no, not because you had wealth, but because you had the audacity to survive without it. There's a clatter of dice on the tavern table, a chorus of laughter, and the sour, sweet stench of spilled ale. The men are gathered again, farmers, blacksmiths, travellers, even the parish clear crowded elbow to elbow on splintered benches that groan under their weight. It's not yet dark, but they're deep into their second round, loud enough that the fire flickers with every cheer. If you're nearby, sweeping, serving, or just passing the door, You hear it. The banter, the stories, and the bragging. It starts like this. Did you see the miller's girl at the feast? One says, chin slick with grease. She wasn't just drinking the wine, she was asking for it. The others laugh. The next man leans in. You think that's something? You should have seen the widow near the river last week. Let me tell you what she let me do. They swap these tales like game tokens. Some are real, most are not. All of them center the same theme. Conquest, not romance, not love. Just domination retold as entertainment mythologized into masculinity. You listen not because you want to, but because you can't not hear. The words fall out into the night like embers, catching in your ears whether you like it or not. Here's your mainstream historical fact. In medieval Europe, taverns, guild halls, and even churchyards were common spaces for men to exchange stories that reinforced male dominance, including sexual boasting. This was part of how male identity was constructed through aggressive performance, often at women's expense. Court records and chronicles contain countless examples of men bragging about seductions or taking women with little regard for consent. But in these stories, women aren't people. They're proof, symbols, status. She said, no. One man crows, grinning, but you know what they say. No from a drunk girl's worth half a yes. Another laughs and slaps the table. My cousin said she bit him. That means she liked it. There's that fire, you know. The laughter crescendos. And you grip your broom tighter. You grit your teeth. You remind yourself not to show it on your face because they're not just talking about women like you. They might be talking about you or someone you love. This is what historians now call locker room law. And it wasn't confined to locker rooms. It was the airmen breathed. A culture of casual cruelty dressed up as camaraderie. Stories that blur the lines between seduction and coercion, between pursuit and violation, until the lines vanish entirely. And what happens when one man admits discomfort? Maybe a younger boy, not yet hardened, says, "Are you sure she wanted that?" The laughter stops for a second. Then the sneers start. What? Are you one of them? You'll never keep a woman if you act like a priest. You need to learn how the world works, so he learns. He learns to nod, to laugh, to invent his own stories. Truth matters less than tone. And slowly the world reshapes itself in their image. Here's a bitterly telling fringe tidbit. In the 13th century London, a broad sheet circulated depicting a fictional tavern called the Screaming Mare, where the men boasted that the louder a woman cried, the more they'd achieved. It was meant as satire, but many read it as comedy, some even as instruction. That line between critique and celebration, paper thin. Historians still argue whether this culture created rapists or merely excused them, whether the stories came before the acts or the acts before the stories. But most agree that male storytelling, when left unchecked, has always shaped what's considered normal, acceptable, even admirable. And so the tavern fills again. One man boasts of a girl who ran. "I chased her through the hayfield," he says. "She screamed, but only once. After that, she liked it." Another mutters, "She was lucky I picked her. Plenty of girls want me." They speak of fear as if it's foreplay, of silence as submission, of pain as performance. They don't ask where the women are now because they don't care. They don't see the aftermath. The girl who stays home from church, the widow who hides her face, the sister who starts wearing darker colors and walking with her head down. They don't see the girls who stop laughing, or the mothers who lock their doors tighter, or the friends who never speak again. They see only themselves shining in the candlelight, sharpening their egos on each other's backs. And the women, they survive around the edges. They hear the stories and build barriers. They whisper warnings. Don't go to the river alone. Don't drink from his flask. Don't walk home near the mill, because they've heard it all before. And in private, they name names. They create their own law, not of triumphs, but of dangers. They remember the men who bragged. They tell their daughters. You overhear a girl in the market say, if he talks too much, don't trust him. Her friend nods. They don't elaborate. They don't need to. This is the real history, not the chronicles, but the caution. A system where men speak and women warn, but not all men brag. There are quiet ones, the fathers who walk their daughters home, the brothers who believe, the boys who grow into men without taking what isn't given. They exist. And some of them finally stop laughing at the jokes. Some even speak. One man, older now, sits silent in the tavern while the others howl. He shakes his head, mutters something about shame. The others jeer, but he doesn't take it back. You see him later walking home alone, slower than the rest. You wonder what made him stop laughing. A daughter, a sister, a memory. Historians still argue whether these shifts, these tiny flickers of conscience, changed anything. Did one man's discomfort lead to fewer boasts? Did a single boy's refusal to join the jeering become the seed of resistance? We don't know, but we know this. Cultures are built on stories, and they are undone by stories too. So maybe it starts with one woman who won't let the story end at laughter. Maybe it starts with you. You hear the boasting, you carry it, and then one day you answer it. Not in the tavern, not out loud, but in the way you live, in the way you say no, in the way you teach your children what not to be proud of, and in the way you look at a man when he brags, when he boasts, when he dehumanizes, and you don't flinch, you don't laugh, you stare Dot until the words dry in his throat, and he has to ask himself for the first time why. You rise early now before the sun while the town still sleeps. You like the quiet, no prying eyes, no trailing laughter, just the cold air and the crunch of frost beneath your soles. It's in these moments while the rest of the world forgets itself in sleep that you feel most alive. Not safe, but alive. Because while the world around you insists that women like you must carry shame, shrink, apologize, something in you refuses quietly, carefully, and completely. This is rebellion, not in the form of torches or battle cries, but in whispered warnings, encoded glances in the simple act of not disappearing. You still walk through town, you still meet the baker's eyes. You still speak when spoken to, and sometimes when you're feeling bold, even when you aren't. It isn't revenge, it's survival with your head unbowed. And you're not the only one. All around you are women who have learned to fight back without swords. The widow who plants poison herbs in her garden, not to use, but to remind her neighbors that she could. The midwife who lets certain girls stay in her loft when they need a night away. The servant who returns late from the manor house with muddy boots and a blank expression. Never saying what she's seen, but never pretending she saw nothing. There's no army, no banner, just a web of resistance woven in silence. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Across medieval Europe, women often formed informal networks to protect and support one another, particularly in matters of pregnancy, domestic violence, and sexual transgression. Midwives, nuns, herbalists, and even market women served as silent channels of help and healing in the face of legal and religious systems that often failed them. These networks weren't loud, they weren't officially sanctioned, but they worked. You remember a girl from a neighboring village, bright eyes, loud laugh, always barefoot. always better. Then one day she vanished. You thought she'd died. Months later she returns. Changed. Quieter, but alive. You find out she was hidden by a weaver's wife 3 towns over, nursed back to strength, given new clothes, a second chance. No one calls it rebellion, but that's what it is. There's a joke passed among the older women, those who've stopped caring what people think. God made Eve from Adam's rib, they say, but he gave her a spine of her own. And it's true, you start to feel it. That spine, it stiffens every time someone calls you ruined. It straightens every time a man looks at you like he knows your story. It sharpens your tongue when someone accidentally brushes against you in the market. Your rebellion is not to fight, it's to remain. You teach younger girls how to walk through alleys and when to lie. You teach them the art of silence, not the kind that shames, but the kind that protects. When a girl cries after something happens, you don't say, "Be strong," you say, "I believe you," because that alone can change everything. Historians still debate how much these underground sisterhoods influenced real change. Some argue they were too scattered to be effective. Others claim they were the seeds of later feminist resistance. Either way, they mattered. They mattered because they were the only help many women ever had. You recall one winter when a girl from the Lord's household showed up at your door. Her hands were shaking. You didn't ask questions. You fed her, wrapped her in wool, let her sleep. The next morning, she left without a word, but with steadier breath. That's how this works. No speeches, no rewards, just the quiet rebellion of care. And care in this world is dangerous. It challenges the idea that shame is inevitable. It pushes back against the belief that women must carry pain alone. So you share what you know, how to brew valerian root to ease trembling, how to fake a limp to escape unwanted attention, how to answer, "Where were you?" with a look that stops the question short. And slowly, subtly, the girls around you grow stronger. One refuses a marriage proposal, politely but firmly. Another speaks in court, even though her voice shakes. A third runs away and doesn't come back. Each small act a ripple in the quiet. There's a legend told by washerwomen in the south of a saint who could not be burned because her shame had already burned her to the core. They say she walked through flames unblinking and turned her judges to stone. You don't believe in saints, but you believe in fire. You've lived it, and now you carry it. Sometimes that fire is just knowing what not to say, like when the local Lord Steward brags about taming a girl in the hayfield. You don't scream, you watch, you remember, you pass his name along quietly to the women who need to know. Sometimes the fire is in what you do say, like when the priest scolds a girl for inviting attention, and you interrupt softly but clearly. Some men look, no matter what we wear. The room falls still. Then the whispers start. But they're not about you this time. They're because of you. You don't claim to be brave. You're not trying to be a hero, but you are done pretending shame belongs to you. That's your rebellion, and it spreads. There's a young bride in town who walks faster than she used to, a widow who starts wearing red again, a girl who no longer flinches when someone says her name. These are not revolutions, but they are refusals. And sometimes refusal is enough to shift the world by an inch. You think of the mothers who hush their daughters when men pass. You don't blame them, but you hope their daughters don't listen. You think of the girls who dream of escape. You don't stop them, but you teach them what to carry. You think of the ones who didn't make it, the ones silenced, erased, buried under scandal or stone. You remember them. You say their names in your prayers, not because you expect salvation, but because they deserve to be named. Historians still argue whether these quiet resistances built a foundation for future reform, whether the whispered alliances of women laid the groundwork for the louder voices to come. But you don't need their agreement, you know the truth. Change doesn't always march. Sometimes it tiptoes and sometimes it sits unyielding, like a woman who refuses to lower her gaze. So you keep rising early. You keep lighting candles. You keep listening when others won't. And you keep walking with every step, every breath, every word you speak with care and courage as a quiet rebellion made flesh. You're older now, not old exactly, but past the part where people expect you to be desirable, past the whispers for the most part, past the stares. Some women say that's a gift, a freedom. You're not so sure. Because when you're no longer the girl in danger, you become the woman with a memory. And that's its own kind of burden. You've lived through a world that saw your body as a commodity, your voice as a threat, your silence as virtue. You've worn the shame, you've hidden the scars, you've watched others fall to the same games. Some who survived, some who didn't. Now you wonder, could any of this ever have been different? You're not the only one asking. Centuries later, scholars in libraries far from your village will puzzle over your life, over the lives of women like you. They'll write books. They'll cross-reference dusty ledgers. They'll argue in lecture halls about what you felt, what you believed, what options you truly had, but you already know. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Historians today remain divided on whether medieval women had meaningful agency in matters of sexual violence and reputation. Some argue that women actively resisted manipulating social codes, leveraging church law, and seeking justice in ways both subtle and overt. Others point to the overwhelming weight of patriarchal control, laws written by men, enforced by men, in systems designed to protect men. It's not a simple question because, yes, some women fought back. Records survive of women who brought cases to court, who named their rapists, who demanded justice, and they stood in front of judges surrounded by disapproval and said, "He did this." Some even won a few, but at what cost? Others resisted differently in the margins, in survival, in teaching their daughters how to be watchful, in building silent networks of support. Was that less powerful than the courtroom? Maybe, maybe not. Historians still argue whether silence was submission or strategy. You can almost hear them debating it. Did she stay quiet because she was scared? Or was she smart enough to know what would happen if she spoke? The answer you want to say is both. Period. It always was. Because this world forced women into impossible choices. Speak and you risk being blamed. Stay silent and you suffer alone. Marry your rapist and you're restored. Refuse and you're ruined forever. Agency in a world like this isn't a clean thing. It's messy. It's contradictory. It's a girl who laughs at the man who hurt her because it's the only way she can keep him from trying again. It's a woman who never speaks his name but tells everyone to avoid him anyway. It's survival disguised as compliance. And sometimes compliance disguised as survival. That's the complexity historians don't always capture. They look at records. You live the reality. Here's a fringe tidbit. In a little-known 15th century German codex, a letter was found, unsigned, anonymous, written by a woman to a cleric. In it, she described the way her world collapsed after being raped by a nobleman, not just because of the act itself, but because of how others responded. They say, "I am less now," she wrote. "I feel I am more aware, more awake, more dangerous, but no one will ever see me that way." The letter ended without farewell, just a line. I did not choose this story, but I choose to remember it. No one knows what happened to her, but you know her. She is you or someone like you. And she's not the only one who asked if change was possible. Throughout the medieval period, voices often quiet, often drowned, tried to say, "This isn't right." Some came from women, some from priests, from monks, from strange corners of the legal world. A few male writers dared to imagine women as more than objects. A few churchmen questioned why a sin committed against a woman was treated as hers. They were rare, and they were often ignored, but they existed. Historians still argue whether those voices represented real possibility or were simply anomalies. Brief flickers in a dark sea. You're not interested in flickers. You want fire. But here's the painful truth. Systemic change doesn't come from a single spark. It comes from embers quietly growing. You think about the young girls now, the ones who ask questions a little too loudly. The ones who scoff when someone says a man's nature is just that way. The ones who wear red not as a mark of shame, but of defiance. They're different from how you were. And maybe that means the world is changing, even if the laws haven't caught up. But you also see how far there is to go, because shame is sticky. It survives plagues and kings and reform. It burrows into the language, into the rules, into the bones of things. Even now, women carry the weight of other sins and are told to call it virtue. Even now, the questions remain the same. What were you wearing? Why were you alone? Are you sure you said no? You don't need a historian to tell you that, but perhaps, just perhaps, the future they debate is already being built. Not in courts, but in kitchens, in quiet talks by the fire, in the way women refuse to let other women be erased. You've seen it. You've helped build it. Every time you listen without judgment, every time you share your story, whether in full or just in fragments, every time you remind a girl that what happened to her does not define her. You're laying down stones for a path you may never walk. You do it anyway. Historians may continue to argue, and they should, but you know that change doesn't begin with certainty. It begins with refusal to accept the script, refusal to carry the shame, refusal to stay silent when silence is betrayal. And that's what you've done all this time, even when you didn't have the words for it, even when no one noticed, even when you weren't sure it mattered. It did. It does. And centuries from now, maybe a scholar will stumble across your name or the story of someone like you buried in a ledger or a letter or a prayer book. And maybe they'll stop and wonder, was she afraid? Was she brave? Did she hope? You'll never get to answer them, but someone will. A woman who read your story and felt less alone. A girl who found your words and saw herself. And she'll know you weren't just surviving. You were fighting in your way on your terms. And through her, you will continue to speak. You wake one morning to the sound of children's feet outside, chasing each other through the dew-soaked grass. Their shrieks of laughter echo between the houses, and for a moment you smile until one boy yells something that stops you cold. She's asking for it. It's meant as a joke, a chant, to tease another child. The words aren't his. He's too young to understand what they mean, but someone said them where he could hear. Someone laughed when they were said. Someone somewhere still thinks it's funny. And just like that, you know it's not over. Your bones are tired. Your hands ache in the cold. You've lived long enough to see hairstyles change. Seasons repeat. Children become parents, and girls become shadows of their former selves. You've outlived husbands, priests, midwives, and even the boys who used to stare too long at the well. But some things have not changed. The words, the stories, the shame. It's the way people still ask what you did when you say something happened. The way they still expect women to prove their innocence instead of forcing men to account for guilt. The way the church still teaches purity as a gift you must guard with your life. And how losing it, no matter how still, sounds like your fault. You don't need new laws to tell you how deep these roots go. But here's your mainstream historical fact. Although rape laws have evolved significantly since medieval times, many foundational ideas still linger. In parts of Europe well into the 19th century, and even in early US legal systems, a woman's past sexual history was admissible as evidence in court to challenge her credibility. This practice, born of centuries-old distrust, didn't begin with modern judges. It began with medieval whispers. And in many places today, it hasn't fully gone away. You once heard a woman read from a modern book brought from a nearby city. It was about a trial, one that sounded eerily familiar. A woman testifies that she was assaulted. The defense asks what she was wearing, who she was drinking with, whether she'd flirted. The verdict, unclear. You'd think it was your story, rewritten in court jargon. Even the language hasn't changed. Take the phrase "lost her virginity," lost like it was carelessly misplaced. Never mind if it was stolen, never mind if it was taken by force. The burden still falls on her to find it again somehow, or defiled. A word that makes women sound like temples knocked down by earthquakes, as if they were buildings, not breathing, thinking people. Even consent, the word they use now in legal papers and educational posters, still echoes with hesitation. It's defined in dry terms: permission, agreement, willingness. But in the real world, it's a word people twist to mean she didn't say no loud enough. Historians still argue whether these echoes in modern law are relics of direct continuity or cultural carryovers passed down in silence. But for women like you, who've lived both the medieval law and its modern cousins, doesn't matter how the shame travelled, it arrived all the same. Here's a strange and almost laughable fringe tidbit. In a French courtroom in the early 1800s, a judge cited medieval theology in defense of a man accused of assault, stating that a woman's modesty will always manifest itself in resistance, even if her mouth does not say no. This wasn't a trial from the Middle Ages. This was during Napoleon's reign. And yet the logic had barely moved centuries apart. Same script. So what's changed? Some things. Now women gather in public to tell their stories on paper, in speech, online. They hold signs, they protest, they shout. Some are heard, some are believed, and yet others are not. You've seen girls walk into police stations and walk back out crying. You've seen trials delayed, dismissed, defamed. You've seen communities that still whisper, "She's one of those women when a woman speaks out." But you've also seen solidarity. You've seen daughters stand up for mothers. You've seen strangers believe strangers. You've seen men who no longer laugh at the jokes. And perhaps most powerful of all, you've seen women refuse to be quiet anymore. They gather in circles, in support groups, in chat rooms and town halls. They say, "Me too." They say, "Not again." They names, they raise their hands, they show their scars, even the invisible ones. And though you'll never live in their world, you smile knowing they're building one you tried to imagine once, back when imagining felt like treason. Historians still debate whether we're in the middle of true transformation or just another temporary wave. But in your heart, you believe the wheel is turning slowly, painfully, but unmistakably. because these girls no longer carry shame like you did. They wear anger, righteousness, demand, and most importantly, they share it. You sit by the fire now, an old woman with a young mind. You no longer hide the stories. You tell them to your granddaughter, to the neighbor's child, to the apprentice from the next town who brings bread and stays a little too long asking questions. You tell them what they need to know, that it's never their fault, that no man's pride should weigh more than their peace. That shame is not a gift, it's a weapon, and weapons can be thrown away. You speak slowly, sometimes with tears, but without apology, because you have nothing left to lose and everything to give. You tell them about the courtroom that asked why you were alone. You tell them about the priest who offered penance instead of protection. You tell them about the husband who was meant to restore you. And then you tell them about the quiet resistance, the midwives, the widows, the girls who vanished and came back stronger. You tell them how the world once worked and how it must be different now. They listen, some nod, some cry, some ask questions, but none laugh. That's how you know. The echo's fading. It's not gone yet. There's still injustice, still pain, still lawmakers who quote old myths and judges who doubt shaking voices. Still boys repeating chants they don't understand. Still girls who walk home holding keys between their fingers. But there's a break in the rhythm, a crack in the silence. You see it in the laws that name the crime correctly. You see it in the teachers who explain consent before explaining grammar. You see it in the men who stop other men from boasting. You see it in the girls who do not flinch when asked to tell their story. You wonder what would it have been like to grow up in this world where pain is named, where wounds are not called weakness, where belief is not a rare gift, but a standard practice. You'll never know. But that's all right, because you helped make it possible. With your breath, with your story, with your survival, the language has changed. The laws are catching up. And the echo that once haunted every corner of your life, it's finally being answered. You're sitting by the window now. The light is soft and golden, pouring through the clouded glass in long stripes. The wind rustles the trees in that half-whispered way, and the fire behind you cracks and sighs, throwing shadows on the stone floor. It's one of those rare moments when the world feels like it's breathing in time with you. You're no longer the girl running from stairs. You're no longer the woman silenced in the courtroom. The wife pretending she wasn't afraid. The widow hiding from the names they tried to give you. You're simply you. All of it all at once. And still the healing continues. Because healing, like history, is not a clean line. It stutters, it halts, it slips backward on bad days. There are mornings you wake with a weight on your chest and you can't remember if it's memory or the weather. There are nights when sleep is a stranger, and there are years, yes, entire years that pass when no one speaks your name with cruelty. And there are years, yes, entire years that pass when no one speaks your name with cruelty. And yet you still flinch when someone walks too fast behind you. This is how deep it goes. Not because you're broken, but because the world made sure the wound was never just physical. Healing has never been just about forgetting. It's about learning to carry without it poisoning you. It's about finding ways to own your story without being owned by it, and that you've learned takes a lifetime. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Psychological trauma from sexual violence has been documented since antiquity, though rarely named as such until the 19th and 20th centuries. The concept of post-traumatic stress may be modern, but the experience itself is ancient. For centuries, women lived with the aftermath of violence and silence, often blamed for the symptoms of their own suffering, but you've given those symptoms names now. The hands that tremble when someone knocks too loudly, the heart that races when someone touches you without asking, the tears that come during prayer, not for salvation, but for strength. You name them, and in naming them you loosen their grip. Still, the stories around you remain unfinished. There's the girl next door, too young to understand why the village boys look at her that way. There's the mother who still hasn't told her husband what happened that night all those years ago. There's the baker's apprentice who stops talking whenever the priest enters the room. You see them, you recognize them, and sometimes, if the moment is right, you reach out. You don't need to ask what happened. You just offer a chair, a cup of tea, a silence that is not judgment, but invitation. Sometimes that's all someone needs. Here's a haunting little fringe tidbit. In an 11th century convent near Bologna, a set of anonymous letters was found, written by women who had taken holy vows after losing their virtue. One wrote, "They say I belong to God now. That the truth is, I belong only to the pain I hide. I sing his hymns, but inside, I'm still weeping." You read those words once, someone brought them from a distant monastery, and you wept. Not because they were sad, but because they were true. You know now that healing cannot always be completed. Some stories don't get clean endings. Some pain settles like dust in the corners of your mind, but even so, the house of your soul can still be beautiful, still be lived in, still hold warmth. Historians still argue whether societies like yours ever truly allowed women to recover, whether the burden of shame was ever lifted, whether the scars were ever seen as anything but sin. You argue back, not in books, in life. You argue by laughing again, by tending the garden that once grew only thorns, by dancing with children at the harvest, by humming songs in the morning that are entirely your own. These are your rebuttals, each one a page in a better book. And you've written other pages too. You've taught girls how to look people in the eye. You've shown boys that strength is not silence, but empathy. You've made your own family, not just of blood, but of choice. A neighbor who came to you with bruises now sings with her head high. A child you once sheltered now teaches letters to daughters who would have never gone to school. A woman who once thought herself ruined now sits with you, knitting, smiling, whole in her own way. These are your victories, quiet, enduring, miraculous. And yes, the world outside still struggles. In some towns, nothing has changed. In others, change is a whisper, barely louder than a prayer. But it's there in the way people pause before judging, in the questions women dare to ask, in the stories they finally tell. You once heard someone say, "We are the granddaughters of the witches they couldn't burn." It made you smile, not because you were ever a witch, but because you understand what it means to carry fire in your blood and not let it consume you. Instead, you use it for light, for warmth, for others. And now, as the sky outside turns gold and the trees sway like old women nodding in approval, you realize something. Your story was never just yours. It was always part of something bigger. The shame they tried to stitch into your skin, it unraveled. The silence they demanded, it broke. And from those broken pieces came something unexpected. Not perfection, not peace, but truth. The truth that what happened to you was not your fault. The truth that your voice matters. The truth that your survival is not just endurance, it's legacy. So you sit now by the window and watch the shadows lengthen. The fire dies down. The children's laughter fades into the distance, and you allow yourself to rest. Not because you're done fighting, but because you've made it this far. And that is enough for tonight. Sweet dreams, sweet